The cool autumn breeze swept through Central Park as Mason Wells checked his watch. Another board meeting in 30 minutes. At 45, he had amassed more wealth than most could dream of in several lifetimes. His investment firm, Wells Capital, occupied the top floors of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, a testament to his ruthless business acumen and unwavering focus. Mr. Wells, Governor Patterson's office called again about the charity gala. His assistant's voice chirped through his earpiece. "Tell him I'll donate the usual amount, but I won't attend," Mason replied curtly, quickening his pace along the park path. Public appearances were necessary evils, calculated moves on a chessboard where image translated to investor confidence. He'd mastered the game long ago, but found little joy in playing it anymore. He tightened his cashmere scarf against the chill and veered toward the exit that would lead him back to his waiting car. That's when he heard it. A small voice cutting through the morning bustle. "Excuse me, sir." Mason turned to find a boy, no older than 7, standing alone near a park bench. The child's clothes were clean but visibly worn, a faded blue jacket with frayed cuffs, sneakers with scuffed toes, and jeans a size too large. Dark curls framed a face that bore an expression far too serious for someone so young. "I'm late for a meeting," Mason said reflexively, already turning away. "Please," the boy persisted, his voice steady despite its softness. "Be my dad for a second." Mason froze. The request was so unexpected, so bizarre, that it cut through his practiced indifference. He turned back slowly, studying the child more carefully. The boy's eyes, a deep brown with flecks of amber, held a wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. "What did you say?" Mason asked, his tone sharper than intended. The boy didn't flinch. "Be my dad for a second, please. I just need you to sign this." He held up a crumpled school form. "My teacher says I can't go on the museum field trip without a parent's signature." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Where is your father? Your mother?" "Mom's working double shifts at the hospital." "She's a nurse," the boy explained matter-of-factly. "She forgot to sign it yesterday and it's due today." "And your father?" A small shrug. "Don't have one." Something about the boy's directness, the complete absence of self-pity, made Mason pause. In his world of complex financial deals and calculated risks, this was the simplest of requests, yet somehow the most disarming. "What's your name?" Mason asked, surprising himself with the question. "Elijah. Elijah Carter." Mason glanced at his watch again. 25 minutes until the board meeting. His driver would be circling the block by now. The rational part of his brain, the part responsible for building his empire, was already calculating the cost of this delay. "I can't sign your form, Elijah. That would be forgery." Mason's voice softened slightly. "Where's your school? Is it nearby?" 3 blocks that way, Elijah pointed east. West Side Elementary. Against his better judgment, Mason made a decision. "I'll walk you there and explain the situation to your teacher." Relief flooded the boy's features, transforming him instantly into the child he should be. "Really?" "Thank you." As they walked, Mason's assistant called twice. He silenced both calls. Elijah filled the silence with observations about everything they passed. A particular cloud formation, a dog that looked like his neighbors, the way the morning light hit the buildings. His perspective was refreshingly uncomplicated. "What grade are you in?" Mason asked during a brief lull. "Second, Mrs. Patterson's class." "And the field trip, where are you going?" "The Natural History Museum. We're studying dinosaurs." Elijah's face lit up. "Did you know T-Rex couldn't actually run? If it went too fast, it would break its legs because it was so heavy." Despite himself, Mason smiled. "I didn't know that. My mom got me a book from the library. I've read it 14 times. Pride colored the boy's voice. "She says I might be a paleontologist someday." They reached the school, a modest brick building with children's artwork displayed in the windows. The morning bell had already rung, and the playground stood empty. At the front office, Mason introduced himself to the secretary, who regarded him with undisguised suspicion until he explained the situation. Moments later, Mrs. Patterson arrived, a kind-faced woman in her 50s whose eyes widened in recognition when she saw Mason. "Mr. Wells?" "The Mason Wells." Mason nodded curtly. "Elijah here tells me he needs this form signed for tomorrow's field trip." Mrs. Patterson blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, but how do you—" "We met in the park," Mason cut in. His mother works double shifts and couldn't sign the form. I offered to explain the situation. Understanding dawned on the teacher's face. Of course. We can make an exception in this case. She smiled at Elijah. Why don't you head to class? We're about to start math. As Elijah turned to go, he looked up at Mason. Thank you for being my dad for a second. Something shifted in Mason's chest, a sensation so foreign he couldn't immediately identify it. The boy's simple gratitude cut through years of practiced detachment. You're welcome, Elijah. After the boy disappeared down the hallway, Mrs. Patterson turned to Mason. That was incredibly kind of you, Mr. Wells. Elijah is one of our brightest students, but his situation is challenging. His mother works as a nurse? Mason found himself asking. Sarah Carter. Yes. She's raising him alone since his father left when Elijah was an infant. She works at Metropolitan Hospital, often double or triple shifts. She's devoted to Elijah, but it's not easy. Mason nodded, absorbing this information with the same focus he applied to market analyses. Ensure Elijah gets to go on that field trip. Send the invoice for his admission and bus fare to my office. He handed her his business card. The teacher's eyes widened. That's very generous, but it's nothing, Mason said, already turning to leave. I have a meeting to attend. Back in his car, Mason found himself distracted during the short drive to his office. Elijah's words echoed in his mind. Please be my dad for a second. The board meeting proceeded as expected. Quarterly projections, acquisition proposals, risk assessments. Mason contributed with his usual incisiveness, but his thoughts kept drifting to the boy in the park. When the meeting finally concluded, he remained seated as the others filed out. Everything all right, Mason? Asked Gregory Hughes, the company's CFO and Mason's oldest associate. Fine, Mason replied automatically. Then, after a pause, Greg, do you still serve on the board of Metropolitan Hospital? Gregory's eyebrows rose in surprise. Going on 15 years now. Why? No reason, Mason said, gathering his papers. I might have a project in mind. That evening, instead of his usual working dinner, Mason found himself researching West Side Elementary on his tablet. The public school served a primarily working-class neighborhood and had recently faced budget cuts. Their science program, including the field trips that clearly meant so much to young Elijah, was at risk. Mason's finger hovered over his assistant's number. A plan was forming in his mind, a simple solution to what most would consider a minor problem. Yet something held him back. This wasn't like his other philanthropic endeavors, calculated for maximum tax advantage and public relations value. This felt personal. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his estate manager in the Hamptons, probably calling about preparations for the upcoming weekend. Mason let it go to voicemail. Instead, he found himself staring at the Central Park skyline outside his penthouse window, remembering the determined look in Elijah's eyes. Please, be my dad for a second. For a man who had everything, it was strange how those words had made him realize what he lacked. 3 days later, Mason's driver pulled up to Metropolitan Hospital's staff entrance. He'd instructed Roberts to arrive at precisely 7:45 p.m., the end of the evening shift, according to the schedule he'd discreetly obtained from Gregory's hospital connections. Wait here, Mason told Roberts, straightening his tie as he stepped from the car. The autumn evening had turned chilly, with the first hints of winter in the air. Mason had traded his usual bespoke suit for something more understated, a simple navy blazer and charcoal slacks. He didn't want to draw attention, though he realized the absurdity of that thought. In certain circles, Mason Wells was instantly recognizable, his face appearing regularly in financial publications and the occasional society page. He positioned himself near the staff exit, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. What exactly was he doing here? He told himself it was simple curiosity, a loose end to tie up before moving on. Yet he knew there was more to it than that. A steady stream of hospital staff began exiting the building, their faces bearing the particular brand of exhaustion that came from caring for others. Mason scanned the crowd, working from the vague description Mrs. Patterson had provided and the handful of details from Elijah. Then he saw her, Sarah Carter. She couldn't be anyone else, the same serious eyes as her son, though hers were rimmed with fatigue. Her dark curls were pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she walked with the efficient gait of someone who had learned to conserve energy wherever possible. She wore blue scrubs under a worn jacket, a large tote bag slung over her shoulder. Mason stepped forward, suddenly aware that he hadn't fully thought this encounter through. "Miss Carter." She stopped, wariness immediately replacing exhaustion. "Yes? I'm Mason Wells. I met your son Elijah in Central Park a few days ago." Her expression shifted to alarm. "Is Elijah okay? Did something happen?" "He's fine," Mason assured her quickly. "I walked him to school that morning. He needed a form signed for a field trip." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, but confusion remained. "Mr. Wells, why are you here?" It was a fair question, one for which Mason didn't have a prepared answer. In negotiations, he never entered without knowing his desired outcome and several paths to achieve it. This situation was different. "I wanted to make sure Elijah got to go on his field trip," he said finally, "to the Natural History Museum." Sarah's expression softened. "Yes, he went yesterday. He hasn't stopped talking about it." A small smile touched her lips. Apparently, the T-Rex was even bigger than he'd imagined. Mason found himself returning her smile. He mentioned his fascination with dinosaurs. "Wait," Sarah said, realization dawning. "Mason Wells. You're that Mason Wells?" Her eyes widened. "The school mentioned a benefactor covered the field trip costs for several students, but I never imagined—" She shook her head in disbelief. "It was nothing," Mason said, feeling strangely exposed. "It wasn't nothing to Elijah," she countered. "He was so excited he could barely sleep the night before." She studied him with newfound curiosity. "But that doesn't explain why you're here now." Mason had asked himself the same question repeatedly during the drive over. The truth was, something about that brief interaction with Elijah had stuck with him, had burrowed under his skin in a way few things did anymore. "I thought perhaps we could discuss a more permanent arrangement," he said, falling back on the formal language of business. "A scholarship of sorts for Elijah." Sarah's expression hardened instantly. "We don't need charity, Mr. Wells." "It's not charity," Mason replied, though even he recognized the falsehood. "It's an investment in potential. Your son is clearly bright." "He is," she agreed, pride momentarily overriding her defensiveness. "But we're managing just fine." Mason thought about the frayed cuffs on Elijah's jacket, the worn sneakers. He thought about Sarah working double shifts while her son navigated the park alone before school. Managing seemed a generous assessment. "Of course," he said, backpedaling. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise." An awkward silence fell between them. In the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. "Look, Mr. Wells," Sarah finally said, her voice softening slightly. "I appreciate what you did for Elijah, truly, but we're strangers to you. Why would you want to help us?" It was the question Mason had been avoiding. Why indeed? He had donated millions to various causes over the years, hospitals, universities, arts organizations. But those were strategic decisions, carefully calculated for maximum benefit. This was different. This was personal. "Your son asked me to be his dad for a second," Mason said quietly. "No one has ever asked me that before." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. She glanced at her watch. "I need to get home to Elijah. Mrs. Wilson from upstairs is watching him, but she goes to bed early." Mason nodded, disappointed but not surprised. "Of course." Sarah hesitated, then reached into her bag for a pen. She scribbled something on a small notepad and tore out the page. "This is my number. If you're serious about wanting to help Elijah, maybe we can talk." She handed him the paper. "But I want to be clear. I'm not looking for a handout or a savior." "Understood," Mason said, pocketing the number. As she turned to go, Mason called after her. "Ms. Carter, would it be all right if I sent Elijah something? A book about dinosaurs, perhaps?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. "He'd like that," she said finally. And then she was gone, striding toward the subway entrance with the same purposeful efficiency she'd displayed at first. Mason returned to his car, unsettled in a way he rarely experienced. Roberts raised an eyebrow in the rearview mirror, but knew better than to ask questions. "The office," Mason instructed, though it was nearly 9 o'clock. At Wells Capital, the night cleaning crew was making their rounds. Mason nodded to the security guard and took the private elevator to his floor. The familiar surroundings of his office, the awards on the walls, The view of the city skyline, the antique desk that had once belonged to his father, usually brought a sense of accomplishment. Tonight, they felt hollow. He opened his laptop and began a search for children's books about paleontology. After selecting several highly rated options, he paused, finger hovering over the purchase button. Was this crossing a line? Sarah had given permission, but Mason recognized he was entering uncharted territory. His phone rang. Caroline Bennett, his ex-wife. "Mason, did you forget about the foundation dinner next Friday?" she asked without preamble when he answered. "No," he lied. In truth, he had forgotten entirely. The Bennett-Wells Foundation had continued its work after their divorce 5 years ago, with both of them maintaining professional involvement despite their personal separation. "Good, because the Morgan Museum is counting on our announcement about the new wing. The press will be there." Mason rubbed his temples. "I'll be there, Caroline. Are you all right? You sound distracted." Mason considered telling her about Elijah and Sarah, but decided against it. Caroline would analyze his interest through the lens of their own failed relationship, their mutual decision not to have children, the growing distance that had eventually made their marriage unsustainable. "Just tired," he said instead. "It's been a long week." After hanging up, Mason returned to the book order and completed the purchase, adding a note to have them gift-wrapped and delivered to the Carter apartment. The address had been easy enough to obtain through his network. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason found himself thinking about Elijah frequently. He wondered if the boy had received the books, if he'd liked them. Several times, he took out the paper with Sarah's number, but always stopped short of calling. What would he say? What did he actually want from this connection? The answer came unexpectedly, during a meeting with the board of his family's foundation. They were discussing annual grants, and the focus had turned to education initiatives. "The problem with these school programs," remarked Bernard Hoffman, a longtime board member, "is that they're like placing a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. The issues are systemic, so we shouldn't try at all," Mason asked, more sharply than intended. Bernard looked surprised at his tone. "I'm simply suggesting we focus our resources where they'll have maximum impact." Maximum impact. It was the phrase Mason himself had used countless times when evaluating potential investments or philanthropic endeavors. Suddenly, it felt cold, detached from the human reality of people like Sarah and Elijah, people who needed help now, not when some perfect systematic solution materialized. After the meeting, Mason finally called the number Sarah had given him. "Hello." Her voice sounded wary. "Miss Carter, it's Mason Wells. I was hoping we could meet again." "To discuss that scholarship for Elijah?" There was a long pause. "Elijah loved the books," she said finally. "He sleeps with the T-Rex encyclopedia under his pillow." Mason felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "I'm glad." Another pause. "I'm off this Sunday afternoon. There's a coffee shop near our apartment, Cornerstone Cafe on 76th. "I'll be there," Mason promised. "What time works for you?" 2 o'clock, and Mr. Wells, Elijah will be with me." After they hung up, Mason sat back in his chair, a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness washing over him. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. When the day finally arrived, Mason found himself changing his outfit 3 times, something he hadn't done since his first major investor presentation 20 years ago. He ultimately settled on casual slacks and a light sweater, determined not to intimidate with his usual formal attire. The cafe was modest but charming, with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. Mason arrived 15 minutes early, securing a corner table away from the windows. He ordered a black coffee and waited, checking his watch every few minutes. At precisely 2 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Sarah entered, Elijah's small hand clasped firmly in hers. The boy was wearing a new jacket, still modest, but without the frayed cuffs of the previous one. When he spotted Mason, his face lit up with recognition. "It's you, the park dad." Sarah looked mortified, but Mason found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Hello again, Elijah." As they approached the table, Mason noticed Sarah scrutinizing him, perhaps searching for hidden motives or signs of insincerity. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, because she smiled. A real smile that transformed her tired features and revealed a glimpse of the woman she might be under different circumstances. "Thank you for the books, Mr. Wells," she said. sliding into the seat across from him. They were very generous. Too generous, Elijah added with the brutal honesty of childhood. Mom said we might have to sell one to pay the electric bill, but I convinced her not to. Sarah's cheeks flushed. Elijah! Mason pretended not to notice her embarrassment. Well, I'm glad you kept them all, and please call me Mason. As Elijah launched into an enthusiastic description of his favorite dinosaur facts, Mason caught Sarah's eye across the table. In that moment, something passed between them. A shared appreciation for the boy's uninhibited joy, perhaps, or a mutual recognition that this strange meeting might be the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. For a man who had built his life on careful planning and calculated risks, Mason found himself surprisingly content to let this particular story unfold on its own. By early December, a tentative routine had formed. Mason met with Elijah and Sarah every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes they visited museums or the zoo, other times they simply walked through the park or sat in the cafe near Sarah's apartment. The scholarship for Elijah had been established, carefully structured as an educational trust that Sarah could access for anything related to her son's development, from school supplies to extracurricular activities. Today, they were at the Natural History Museum again, Elijah's favorite place. The boy raced ahead to the dinosaur exhibit he'd visited countless times, while Mason and Sarah followed at a more measured pace. He's doing much better in school, Sarah said, watching her son with evident pride. His teacher says his confidence has improved dramatically. He's a remarkable child, Mason replied. Over the past weeks, he'd grown increasingly impressed by Elijah's quick mind and insatiable curiosity. Sarah glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. You know, when we first met, I thought you were just another rich guy with a guilty conscience looking for a charity case. Mason winced. And now I think you're a good man who's been alone too long. Her directness, so similar to her son's, never failed to catch Mason off guard. Before he could respond, Elijah called from across the hall. Mom? Mason, come see the new Triceratops display. As they watched Elijah press his face against the glass, eyes wide with wonder, Mason felt a strange contentment he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. His phone buzzed in his pocket, likely another message from Caroline about the Foundation's upcoming holiday gala. But for once, he didn't immediately check it. Penny, for your thoughts? Sarah asked, noticing his momentary distraction. I was just thinking about how unexpected all this is, Mason admitted. If you'd told me 3 months ago that I'd be spending my Sundays at museums with a 7-year-old paleontologist in training. Sarah laughed, a warm, genuine sound that Mason had come to look forward to. Life has a way of surprising us. After the museum, they stopped for hot chocolate at a small cafe near Central Park. Elijah, chocolate mustache adorning his upper lip, looked between the adults with a thoughtful expression. Mason, are you going to come to my school play? He asked suddenly. I'm a tree, but I have 3 whole lines. Mason hesitated, glancing at Sarah. They had established a comfortable routine, but this felt like crossing into new territory. When is it? Next Thursday evening, Sarah answered. It's their holiday production. I'd be honored to attend, Mason said, meaning it. I'll adjust my schedule. Elijah beamed, then frowned slightly. Will you have to sit by yourself, though? Because Mom usually sits with Mrs. Wilson from upstairs. I'm sure I can find a seat, Mason assured him, amused by the boy's concern. You could sit with us, Elijah suggested, then added with disarming frankness, Mom said you're not her boyfriend, but you're not her boyfriend either. Sarah nearly choked on her hot chocolate. Elijah, I never said that. You told Mrs. Wilson that it was complicated, Elijah countered, complete with air quotes. Mason found himself laughing at Sarah's mortified expression. Well, I'd be happy to sit with you and your mom, complicated or not. Later, as they walked Sarah and Elijah to the subway station, Mason found himself wondering what exactly he was doing. These Sunday outings had become the highlight of his week, pushing aside board meetings, investment reviews, and social obligations in his mental hierarchy of importance. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. You're quiet, Sarah observed as Elijah skipped ahead, pretending to be a velociraptor. Just thinking, Mason replied. Dangerous pastime. Indeed. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been building for weeks. Sarah, would you consider joining me for dinner sometime? Just the 2 of us. She looked surprised, then thoughtful. Like a date? Yes, Mason said, abandoning pretense. Exactly like that. Sarah studied him for a long moment. I'd like that, she finally said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. But it would have to be an evening when I'm not working, and Mrs. Wilson is available to watch Elijah. I can wait, Mason assured her. The school auditorium was packed with parents, siblings, and grandparents when Mason arrived the following Thursday. He spotted Sarah near the front, saving him a seat as promised. She was wearing a simple green dress, the first time he'd seen her in anything other than scrubs or casual weekend clothes, and had done something different with her hair. The effect was striking. You look lovely, he said quietly, as he took the seat beside her. Thank you, she replied, seeming both pleased and slightly uncomfortable with the compliment. I don't get many opportunities to dress up. The lights dimmed before Mason could respond, and the elementary school production of Winter in the Forest began. Elijah, true to his word, played a tree, the tallest one, with an impressively constructed costume of brown and green crepe paper. When he delivered his 3 lines without a single mistake, Mason found himself applauding as enthusiastically as any proud parent. After the performance, they waited in the hallway for Elijah to change out of his costume. Several other parents nodded politely to Sarah, their curious glances at Mason not going unnoticed. They're wondering who you are, Sarah murmured, amusement in her voice. What have you told them? Nothing. It's none of their business. She hesitated. Though Elijah has started telling people you're his special friend. The phrase caught Mason off guard, its childish simplicity somehow perfectly encapsulating their unusual relationship. Before he could respond, Elijah burst from the classroom, beaming with post-performance excitement. Did you see me? Did you hear my lines? Mrs. Patterson said I was the best tree she's ever had in the play. You were magnificent, Mason assured him, surprising himself by kneeling down to the boy's level. A true thespian in the making. What's a thespian? Elijah asked. An actor, Sarah explained. A very good one. As they walked toward the exit, one of the teachers approached them, a younger woman Mason hadn't met before. Ms. Carter, could I speak with you for a moment about the holiday food drive? Of course, Sarah replied. Mason, would you mind waiting with Elijah? As Sarah stepped away with the teacher, Elijah slipped his small hand into Mason's, a gesture that had become increasingly common during their outings. The simple trust implied by that tiny hand never failed to move something deep within Mason's chest. Mason, Elijah said seriously, do you like my mum? The directness of the question was pure, Elijah. Yes, I do, Mason answered honestly. Your mum is a remarkable woman. Elijah nodded, satisfied. She likes you too. She smiles more now. Before Mason could process that revelation, a man's voice cut through the hallway noise. Elijah, is that you, buddy? Mason turned to see a man in his mid-30s approaching them. He was handsome in a conventional way, with the casual confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. His expensive leather jacket and designer jeans spoke of money, though not on Mason's level. Elijah's hand tightened around Mason's, his body tensing. Dad? The word hit Mason like a physical blow. Dad. This was Elijah's father, the man who had left when Elijah was an infant, according to Mrs. Patterson. The man crouched down, arms outstretched. Hey, little man, you've gotten so big. Elijah didn't move toward the embrace, remaining firmly at Mason's side. What are you doing here? I came to see you in your play, of course. You were awesome. He glanced up at Mason, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. I'm David Carter, Elijah's father. Mason's mind raced. In all their conversations, Sarah had never mentioned that her ex-husband shared her last name, which meant they had been married, and despite what Mrs. Patterson had said about him leaving when Elijah was an infant, the boy clearly recognized his father. Mason Wells, he replied stiffly, extending his free hand. David's eyes widened in recognition. The investor? Wow. He looked between Mason and Elijah, clearly trying to piece together the relationship. Are you a friend of Sarah's? Before Mason could answer, Sarah returned, stopping abruptly when she saw David. All color drained from her face. David, what are you doing here? I came to see our son's play, David replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You look good, Sarah. The tension between them was palpable. Mason felt Elijah's hand squeeze his even tighter. We need to go, Sarah said, her voice tight. Elijah has school tomorrow. Wait, David protested. I was hoping we could talk, all of us. His gaze lingered on Mason, or maybe just the three of us, family only. Something protective surged in Mason's chest. I believe Sarah said they need to leave. David's expression hardened slightly. No offense, but this is between me and my family. Mason is coming with us, Elijah said suddenly, his young voice unwavering. He's more family than you are. An uncomfortable silence followed the boy's declaration. David looked stunned, then hurt, then angry in rapid succession. I see, he said finally. Well, I'm staying at the Parker Hotel for a few days. Call me when you're ready to talk, Sarah. He turned and walked away without another word. In the taxi ride to Sarah's apartment, Elijah fell asleep, exhausted from the performance and the emotional encounter. Mason and Sarah sat in silence until they were nearly at her building. I should have warned you, Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea he was back in town. Mrs. Patterson told me he left when Elijah was an infant, Mason said carefully. Sarah sighed. That's what I tell people. It's easier than explaining that he's come and gone 4 times since Elijah was born. He shows up, makes promises, then disappears again when things get too domestic for him. Her voice hardened. The last time was 2 years ago. He promised Elijah a trip to Disney World, then cancelled 3 days before they were supposed to leave. He'd gotten a better offer in Europe. Mason felt a surge of anger toward this man who had caused such pain to both Sarah and Elijah. And now he's back. Apparently. Sarah looked out the window, her profile outlined by the passing streetlights. He always had impeccable timing. When they reached her apartment building, Mason carried the sleeping Elijah up the 3 flights of stairs. The boy barely stirred as Sarah unlocked the door to their modest 2-bedroom apartment. His room is this way, she whispered, leading Mason down a short hallway. Elijah's room was exactly what Mason would have expected. Dinosaur posters on the walls, books stacked on every available surface, a small desk covered with drawings and half-completed science projects. Mason gently laid the boy on his bed, and Sarah removed his shoes before pulling a blanket over him. In the living room, Sarah offered Mason a cup of tea, which he accepted more for the opportunity to talk than from any desire for the beverage. David was my high school sweetheart, she said without preamble, sitting across from Mason on the small sofa. We got married right after graduation, too young, looking back. When I got pregnant with Elijah, he panicked. Left the first time before Elijah was even born. Mason listened silently, giving her the space to tell her story. He came back when Elijah was 6 months old, full of remorse and promises. Stayed for almost a year that time. She sighed. The pattern repeated. He'd leave when things got hard, return when he felt guilty or when his latest adventure had run its course. And Elijah remembers him. The last time Elijah was 5, old enough to understand abandonment, too young to protect himself from hoping. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. I swore I wouldn't let David hurt him again. Mason reached across the space between them, taking her hand. What do you think he wants? Money, probably. It's usually money. She gave a bitter laugh. Though now that he's seen you with us, he might think there's a bigger opportunity. The implication was clear. David might see Mason's interest in his family as something to exploit. The thought made Mason's jaw tighten. Sarah, he said carefully, I want you to know that my interest in you and Elijah has nothing to do with charity or guilt or any of the things you might have initially suspected. These past months have been significant to me. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. They've been significant to us, too. She paused. But David showing up complicates things. Only if we let it, Mason countered. Sarah smiled faintly. For a man who deals with complex financial structures all day, you have a remarkably straightforward approach to personal matters. Perhaps because I've spent too many years complicating what should be simple. Mason squeezed her hand. Sarah, regardless of what happens with David, I'm not going anywhere. She studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed him softly, their first kiss brief but full of promise. I should go, Mason said reluctantly, knowing that neither of them was ready for more than this tentative beginning. At the door, Sarah touched his arm. Thank you for everything. I'll call you tomorrow, Mason promised. The next morning, Mason was reviewing acquisition proposals in his office when his assistant interrupted with an unexpected visitor. "Sir, there's a David Carter here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent." Mason's surprise quickly turned to wariness. "Send him in." David entered with the same casual confidence he'd displayed at the school, though it seemed slightly diminished in the imposing surroundings of Mason's office. "Mr. Wells," he began. Declining to sit in the chair Mason indicated, "I'll get right to the point. I want to know what your intentions are toward my family." The audacity of the question momentarily stunned Mason. "Your family? Sarah and Elijah are still legally my family," David stated. "Sarah and I never divorced." The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. Not divorced, which meant, "You're still married," he said flatly. David nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression at Mason's obvious shock. "Going on 9 years now." Mason stared at David, his mind racing to process this revelation. "Does Sarah know you're here?" "No," David admitted, finally taking the seat across from Mason's desk. "But I think we should talk, man to man." Mason's instinct was to throw David out of his office, but years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him to control his emotions. "I'm listening." "I made mistakes," David began, his tone practiced, as if he'd rehearsed this speech. "I was young, scared of responsibility, but I've changed. I want another chance with my family." "Your family that you've abandoned repeatedly?" Mason couldn't keep the edge from his voice. David's expression hardened. "Look, I don't know what Sarah's told you, but enough for me to understand the pain you've caused Elijah," Mason interrupted. "A child who flinches at the mention of Disney World because his father broke yet another promise." David had the grace to look ashamed, if only momentarily. "I want to make amends. I have a good job now, stability. I can provide for them." "Sarah doesn't need your provision," Mason countered. "She's managed admirably without you." "With your help recently," David shot back. "But she's still my wife. We took vows." "Vows you've broken repeatedly." The two men stared at each other across the desk, the tension palpable. "What do you want, David?" Mason finally asked. "Really want?" David hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I want a fresh start with my family." "But if that's not possible," he placed the paper on Mason's desk. "These are my terms." Mason opened the document, scanning its contents with growing disbelief. It was a crude settlement proposal. David would agree to a divorce and relinquish all claims to custody of Elijah in exchange for a substantial financial settlement. "You're trying to sell your family," Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm being realistic," David countered. "Sarah and I are done. We both know that. But I have rights as Elijah's father, rights I could assert in court if necessary." He leaned forward. "That would be messy for everyone, especially Elijah." Mason had faced countless negotiations, had stared down adversaries across boardroom tables from New York to Tokyo, but never had he felt such cold fury as in this moment. "Get out of my office," he said, his voice controlled but lethal. "Think about it," David said, standing. "I'm at the Parker until Sunday. After that, my lawyer will be in touch." He strode to the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Elijah seems to like you. That's something." After David left, Mason sat motionless, the settlement proposal still open on his desk. His first instinct was to call Sarah immediately, but he hesitated. This revelation changed everything. Sarah was married, a fact she had concealed from him. Was it deliberate deception, or simply an omission she hadn't thought relevant given David's long absences? His intercom buzzed. "Sir, Miss Bennett is here for your lunch meeting." Mason had completely forgotten his scheduled meeting with Caroline to discuss foundation matters. "Send her in," he said, hastily folding David's proposal and placing it in his desk drawer. Caroline entered, elegant as always in a tailored suit that complemented her silver blonde hair. After their divorce, they had maintained a cordial professional relationship, their shared philanthropic goals stronger than their personal differences. "Mason," she greeted him, then paused, studying his face. "You look terrible. What's happened?" Despite everything, Mason smiled faintly. Caroline had always been perceptive. "It's complicated." "It usually is with you," she replied, taking the seat David had just vacated. "Business or personal?" "Personal," Mason admitted. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Now I'm intrigued. You haven't had a personal crisis since our divorce." Mason hesitated, then found himself telling Caroline about Sarah and Elijah, from their first meeting in the park to David's unexpected appearance and shocking revelation. "So she's still married," Caroline summarized when he finished, "and the husband wants either a reconciliation or a payoff." "That's the essence of it," Mason agreed. "And you're falling in love with this woman and her son," Caroline added, watching him carefully. The statement caught Mason off guard. Was he falling in love? The thought had been there, unexamined, pushed aside by his focus on building a relationship with both Sarah and Elijah. "I care about them," he said finally, "more than I expected to." Caroline nodded, unsurprised. "You should talk to Sarah before making any decisions. Hear her side." "I know," Mason agreed, "but I'm not sure what to say. By the way, your estranged husband visited my office and tried to sell me his parental rights. Start with the truth," Caroline advised, rising to leave. "It's usually simplest." At the door she paused. "For what it's worth, I've never seen you this invested in anyone, even me. Don't let this David person ruin something that could be good for you." After Caroline left, Mason made a decision. He called Sarah. "Can we meet?" he asked when she answered. "There's something we need to discuss." "David came to see you," she said immediately, her voice resigned. "He called me right after." "Then you know what he's proposing?" "Yes." Her voice was tight with anger. "He's always been opportunistic, but this is a new low even for him." "Sarah, why didn't you tell me you were still legally married?" A long silence followed. "Because I don't think of myself as married," she finally said. "David left us so many times for so long that the legal status seemed irrelevant. We've been separated for most of Elijah's life." "I see." Mason tried to keep the hurt from his voice and failed. "Mason, I should have told you," Sarah admitted, "but I was afraid you would see how complicated my life really is and walk away. I've been living as a single mother for so long, I sometimes forget there's a legal document saying otherwise." Mason understood her reasoning, even as the deception stung. "We need to talk in person, not over the phone." "I agree," Sarah said quietly. "I'm working until 7, but after that." "I'll come to your apartment at 8, Mason offered. The hours until their meeting crawled by. Mason cancelled his afternoon appointments, unable to focus on work. Instead, he found himself thinking about Elijah, the boy's bright smile, his endless enthusiasm for dinosaurs, the way he had slipped his hand into Mason's so trustingly. And Sarah, her strength, her fierce protection of her son, the way her rare smiles transformed her tired features. The thought of losing them both left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. At exactly 8 o'clock, Mason knocked on Sarah's apartment door. She opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting just on the other side. The apartment was quiet. "Elijah's at Mrs. Wilson's for a movie night," she explained, leading him to the small living room. "I thought we should talk alone first." They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, an unfamiliar awkwardness between them. "David says he offered you a deal," Sarah began, her voice carefully neutral. "He did," Mason confirmed. "I didn't accept it." "Sigh, but you considered it." There was no accusation in her tone, just a question. "No," Mason said firmly. "Not for a second. I would never participate in something like that." Relief flickered across her features. "He's done this before, tried to use Elijah as leverage. The last time he came back, he threatened to sue for custody unless I gave him money to start a business. I took extra shifts for months to give him what he wanted." Her voice hardened. "He never filed the business paperwork. Used the money to travel to Bali instead." "Sarah," Mason said gently, "why have you never divorced him?" She sighed deeply. "Initially because I couldn't afford a lawyer. Later because every time I mentioned divorce, he threatened to fight for custody of Elijah, not because he wanted to be a father, but because he knew it would hurt me." She looked directly at Mason. "I was trapped, and then I just adapted to the situation. It was easier to let him drift in and out than to provoke a legal battle I couldn't afford to fight." Mason moved closer, taking her hand. "What if you could afford to fight? What if you had someone on your side?" Sarah studied his face. "Mason, I can't ask you to take on my problems." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He squeezed her hand. "Sarah, these past months with you and Elijah have meant more to me than I can express. I don't want to lose that, because of David's manipulation. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked cautiously. Let me help you legally end your marriage to David. No payoffs, no deals, just a clean break that protects you and Elijah. He'll fight it, Sarah warned. He knows he has leverage now, with you in the picture. Let him fight, Mason said simply. I have resources he can't imagine, and more importantly, I have the truth on my side. He's abandoned his family repeatedly. No judge would grant him significant custody. Sarah's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Why would you do this for us? Mason reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. Because Elijah asked me to be his dad for a second, and I find that I want to be there for so much longer than that. He paused, gathering his courage. And because I've fallen in love with his mother. Sarah's breath caught. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. Then she moved forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him. Not the brief, tentative kiss they had shared before, but something deeper, filled with promise and possibility. When they finally separated, Sarah rested her forehead against his. I've been afraid to hope for so long, she whispered. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Mason promised. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. 2 months later, on a crisp February morning, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps, the final divorce decree in her hand. Mason waited nearby with Elijah, who was bundled against the winter chill. Is it done, Mom? Elijah asked as she approached them. It's done, Sarah confirmed, her smile brighter than Mason had ever seen it. We're free. David had eventually accepted a reasonable settlement, enough to restart his life elsewhere, but far less than his initial demand. The threat of a public court battle against one of New York's most powerful businessmen had ultimately proven persuasive. What happens now? Elijah asked, looking between the adults. Mason knelt down to the boy's level. That depends, Elijah. I have something I'd like to ask both of you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I thought about doing this at a fancy restaurant or some meaningful landmark, but I realized the only thing that matters is that we're together. Sarah's eyes widened as Mason opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. Sarah Carter, will you marry me? He looked from her to Elijah. And Elijah, would you allow me the honor of being not just your dad for a second, but your dad for a lifetime? Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Elijah launched himself into Mason's arms with such force that he nearly knocked them both over. Yes, the boy shouted, his voice echoing across the courthouse plaza. Yes, yes, yes! Mason stood, lifting Elijah with one arm while reaching for Sarah with the other. As he held them both, he remembered that day in the park, a chance encounter that had changed everything. The words that had started it all echoed in his mind. Please, be my dad for a second. Sometimes, Mason reflected, a second was all it took to change a life forever. 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and Sarah's co-workers, Mason and Sarah were married. Elijah served as best man, proudly carrying the rings on a small dinosaur-shaped pillow he had insisted on using. During the reception, Mason slipped away to the quiet garden of the venue, needing a moment alone to process the joy of the day. He found Elijah already there, sitting on a bench, staring thoughtfully at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. Everything okay, buddy? Mason asked, sitting beside him. Elijah nodded, leaning against Mason's side. I was just thinking about that day in the park. Me too, Mason admitted. I was so scared to ask you, Elijah confessed. But Mom always says that sometimes you have to be brave to get what you need. Mason put his arm around the boy's shoulders. Your mom is very wise. Do you think it was destiny? Elijah asked. That we met that day? Mason considered the question seriously. As a businessman, he believed in planning, in creating one's own opportunities. But that morning in the park had been something else entirely, a random collision of lives that somehow, against all odds, had created a family. I think, Mason said carefully, that sometimes the universe gives us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. Elijah seemed satisfied with this answer. I'm glad I asked you to be my dad for a second. Mason hugged him closer, his billionaire's eyes filling with tears of gratitude. So am I, Elijah, so am I.